the next day. I never got it, even though we're sitting next to each other the whole trip. He got the medicine, but then read up and heard that you can get a relapse, so he chose not to take it. So I thought, well, I'll just take over-the-counter stuff. Got through that cough syrup to suppress my cough at night. Yeah, the acetaminophen.
Well, it's worth avoiding.
The Paxlovid is?
No, the COVID.
The COVID virus, yeah. Yeah, well, I've had all the vaccines, so now I've got some real antibodies, so I'm hoping that, Superman now, and I won't get any version of it again.
Yeah.
But I did read, I think the next day after I got it, the New York Times had an article about the latest virus going around, K-something.2 or something like that.
I think it's stuck with it for a good long time.
They must have run out of Greek letters. Right? They got to what, Zeta and the Zeta variant, and now there's no Greek letters on it. Well, I should probably, let's see, Claudia was coming, I think, wasn't she, and Dave? I started a couple minutes early, first time, and two people came in about 3 slides in and said, hey, we started early, so I don't want to.
Maybe back on Wednesday. Reading is done, and he's busy with Brandon Guilford. Probably gonna drive up to the He loves to drive.
Not to compare, but the morning crowd took all the seats up here in the front.
We need the tables.
Yeah. No, don't feel guilty, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Yeah, if you have nowhere to put yourself, so yeah, sit at the tables, for sure. So. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started, because we're a little bit past noon, and I'll try to keep this to 1 o'clock. So, this presentation on the history of the idea of the rapture is based on a couple of books, one by Martin Vernon called Armageddon, what the Bible really says about the end of the world, and one by Elaine Pagels about how the ideas in Revelations were used through the centuries for political purposes and so on. So I was the whole idea of the rapture, that sort of thing, was foreign to my church experience growing up. I grew up in the Presbyterian church, and it just wasn't a part of our thinking. Although in high school I was exposed to friends that went to churches where this was a more important element of their church history and their thinking. So it was interesting to me to understand where these ideas really came from, and kind of a fun story. Okay, the end is nigh, right? So I'll pick it up in 1988 when Edgar Wiesenen predicted that the world would end at Rosh Hashanah in 1988. I kind of remember this because I had just moved to Corvallis and was actually taking some religion classes at OSU at the time. And he wrote this great book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture is going to be in 1988. That's a great title, right? All the 8s. And he linked, various Bible texts to current events, and said this is why this is going to happen then. And of course, he was wrong. And he was by no means the first one to be wrong about this. Hal Lindsey, does that name ring a bell to people? I've seen the books everywhere. I've even seen the late great Planet Earth title. Also predicted that the end was going to come in the late 80s. And common to these authors and others was this idea that a rapture would spare true believers from all the ills that were to come. So, is the idea of the rapture found in Scripture? Well, throughout most of church history, the answer is no. It's not. But many Christians and non-Christians think that the book of Revelation is really a blueprint for the future, and that this idea of a rapture is foretold in there. And the loudest voices about this, fundamentalists and certain strains of evangelical, pronounce this to the degree where the uneducated or the people that wouldn't know just assume, well, that's what Christians believe, right? Because those are what the airwaves are sort of filled with and present as the predominant, this is what Christians believe. But actually, the word rapture appears nowhere in Scripture. It's absent from Scripture. And Revelation says nothing about the followers of Jesus being taken up before the world destroyed. The idea really came in the 1830s in England, and we'll get into more of the history. But from the writing of the book, through the major theologians in the Middle Ages, no one ever thought of the idea of the rapture. The earliest thinkers about it, Origen in the 3rd century in Alexandria, Augustine in North Africa, all the way through the big guy of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, and then the reformers during the Protestant Reformation. To none of them had the idea of this rapture occurred until this guy, John Nelson Darby, came up with this idea in the 1830s. And he was an Anglican priest and an Irishman, and we'll learn a lot more about him in just a few slides. So they all draw their ideas from the book of Revelation. So let's talk a little bit about Revelations. I did this earlier. So hands up if you've actually read the book of Revelation beginning to end. And don't be embarrassed if you haven't, because there weren't very many hands up earlier. And I did in preparation for this class. And it's a crazy read, right? I mean, it is really a crazy read. Just to even keep the imagery straight. And at the earlier class we talked about timeline. If you tried to create a timeline, it would be nonsensical, really. For nearly 2 millennia, almost no one read Revelation as a prediction of the near future, other than the author of the book, who starts off by saying, these things are about to happen soon, so get ready. So for John of Patmos, we'll learn about John, it was very, very soon. So what is the book of Revelation about? All right, hold on tight, here we go. So it's attributed to John of Patmos. Patmos is an island in the Mediterranean, and it's considered to be written late 1st century, and it falls under the genre of apocalyptic literature, or Elaine Pagels uses an interesting phrase, resistance literature. And the idea is that this genre of literature is on the surface about maybe the end times or revelations of God's plan for the world, but intended to bolster those who might be feeling some persecution and give them a sense that even though you may be being persecuted now, God will make things right in the end, and you will be vindicated. It's very clear that the author was heavily influenced by chapters 7 to 12 in the book of Daniel. There's a lot of parallels there. The book almost didn't make it into the New Testament canon. I think it was the last book to be admitted to the canon, and its authorship was hotly debated among the people making the list of books. And it kind of got in because at the time authorship was attributed to the same author as the Gospel of John. But if you look at the two side by side, you'll see really high classical Greek and really poor Greek. So if it was the same author, they had some reason for really disguising their writing style. And it's now not attributed to the same author as the Gospel of John, but rather to John of Patmos, independent authorship. So an outline. It's about a revelation or an apocalypse. Those words mean the same thing, revealing to John of what God is going to cause to happen in the world. It's told to John through Jesus, to an angel, and directly to John. That's the order. And he's told in the vision to deliver a message to 7 churches in Asia that get named. In the vision, Jesus appears to him, but he appears very stylized, surrounded by 7 lamps. And if you go out on the internet to get pictures to put in your presentations, there is no limit to the crazy imagery that you can come up with here. But when you read the book, you'll see, yeah, Jesus is described as having this sword coming out of his mouth, holding 7 crystals and surrounded by 7 lampstands, and it gets even weirder. But Jesus dictates these letters for John to deliver to these 7 churches. And they had essentially the same sequence. Christ identifies himself by various images, the one who holds the 7 stars, or the first and the last. And he assesses each one of the church's situations, the good and the bad. And he threatens to respond harshly if they don't improve their ways. And he promises rewards to those who return to his good graces. And that's essentially the same outline for each of the 7 letters. The 7 churches may be doing things, different things well or different things poorly, but it's kind of a checklist of here's what you're doing well, here's what you're doing poorly, better get them fixed. So it's quite a different image from the earthly Jesus ministry, blessed are the poor, engaging people, healing, inviting all in, dining with the marginalized. Here Christ is like, you better get your act together, you better believe the right things, or bad things are coming. So it's quite a different image. The letters really set up the conflict for this coming apocalypse, and the elements of that are that Christ is in charge, the Jews are Satan worshipers, Christians should avoid pagans, lax Christians are in danger of losing their salvation. Again, back to those letters, if you don't shape up, you might lose it. And Christ hates those who adhere to wrong beliefs. The faithful are going to be rewarded in the end. So that's sort of the context for all the stuff that is to follow, which again, this is written, probably 2 generations after Jesus' earthly ministry in the Greek diaspora, Jewish diaspora, so outside of Palestine, outside of Galilee, outside of the Jewish homeland, by Greek-speaking authors. So, at this point, the Christian movement's influence on this would be beyond how Jesus was acting out and helping realize the kingdom of God in his own earthly ministry. So the action begins in chapters 4 and 5. John finishes up the letters and he gets to go to the throne room in heaven. And here there's no end of internet images about what John sees when he's there. 4 animals that may represent the different families of beings, or creatures, the zoological categories of wild, domestic, human, and bird, with a lion, an ox, human, and an eagle. There are 24 elders, presumably the 12 patriarchs and the 12 apostles. And God sits on a throne with a scroll in hand that is sealed with 7 seals. And in John's vision, this heavenly vision, an angel, and there's lots of angels around, asks, who's worthy to break the seal? And it's announced that it's the lion from the tribe of Judah, Christ. And then Christ appears on the scene, not as a lion, but as a lamb that's been slaughtered. So what's with that? The one that's worthy is this one, and something else shows up. So in fact, it's the lamb who breaks the first seal. So chapters 6 through 16, basically 11 chapters of destruction, and pretty repetitive destruction. By the end of chapter 6 alone, we've seen the introduction of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the white horseman who's going to conquer the earth with bow and arrows, the red that causes people to slaughter each other, the black that introduces food shortages and starvation, and then the pale green one, which is death itself, destroying a quarter of the world's people. At the opening of the 5th seal, Christians who were executed, and here this may be understood as the Christian martyrs that had been martyred for their faith, at this point in history, and there were martyrdoms happening. The 5th seal, the executed plead for revenge against their enemies, which doesn't seem like a very, when we hear Jesus say, pray for your enemies and those who persecute you, you wonder, well. And then the sixth seal, cosmic chaos, earthquakes, the sun turns black, and we're still just in chapter 6, right? So we've got chapters 7 through 14 left. But after the sixth seal, there's a one-chapter breather from death and destruction in which 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel are sealed with the seal of the living God. They're saved. Countless thousands who wash their robes in the blood of the Lamb are also set aside. Maybe those could be understood as the martyrs. But the seventh seal brings a half hour of silence, and then 7 angels appear, each with a trumpet. So see a pattern here, 7 seals. Now we get 7 angels with 7 trumpets. And with each blow of the trumpet, a whole set of disasters, repeated 6 times. And then at the 7th blast, 7 more disasters introduced by the 7 bowls of God's wrath, each poured out on the earth in succession. And this threefold cycle takes essentially the remaining 10 chapters through chapter 16. One obvious reason why we maybe shouldn't take any of this literally is that if the first seal or the first trumpet blast or the first bowl destroyed the earth, what's left to destroy? Right, with the successive bowls. But this is rich apocalyptic imagery. There's a couple that are more familiar, worth taking a closer look at in these 11 chapters. One in chapter 13, a lot of people are familiar with this, the sea monster that appears with the number 666, and there are some other ancient manuscripts where the number 616, but in either case it's a numerological association with Hebrew that identifies a number for each letter, and when you can take a word and use the numbers, you can express a numerical value for the word, and it's often thought that 616 and 666 both describe Nero, the Emperor Nero, and the variant is whether it's a Greek spelling or Hebrew spelling, I guess. But anyway, an earthly beast appears and encourages everybody to follow the sea monster, and if you want to buy or sell anything during this time, you have to have a mark on your right hand of the beast, the mark of the beast, or you're going to be, you won't be able to buy anything. You'll suffer being an outcast, essentially. Brief interlude includes more destruction. This time it's by Christ using a sickle to harvest the earth, and the imagery there is the blood from this harvest is so deep that it's up to the belly of horses for 200 miles. A lot of blood. After another interlude, third set of 7 disasters, the 7 angels pouring the 7 bowl of God's wrath on the world. The 6th bowl pits the king of the world against Christ in Armageddon, and it's very likely that the name Armageddon for the battle is taken from a place name outside of Jerusalem, Megiddo, where a lot of battles were set that you see throughout the Hebrew Bible. So Megiddo, at Megiddo as this place, is probably what became Armageddon as the final battle itself. Okay, let's see. So after all these cycles of destruction, the prophet's taken into the wilderness to meet the whore of Babylon. And whoever the whore of Babylon is, she's overthrown through heavenly intervention, and the beast is defeated, and the supernatural forces that are behind the beast now need to be dealt with, and that's Satan, who is then put into chains and cast into a bottomless pit for 1,000 years. those who resisted the mark of the beast, putting the 666 on their right hand so they could do commerce, are brought back to life, and they get to rule for 1,000 years. And this represents the first resurrection. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan is released, wages war on the saints, loses, and is cast into the lake of fire where the beast has been for that last 1,000 years. So now it's time for some revenge and justice. And there's a lot of revenge and justice in the book of Revelation. Interestingly, the Greek word for love appears nowhere in the book of Revelation. It may be the only New Testament book that doesn't have the word love in it. So revenge and justice, all the dead are restored to life. Books are opened. If your name is in the book of life, good news for you. If not, you're cast into that lake of fire with the sea monster and Satan, and eventually death and Hades are also cast into the lake of fire. And at this point, no one will die again. Now we get a new heaven, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem. And for the followers of Jesus that have survived all this, the first heaven is replaced and the first earth is replaced. The New Jerusalem is a place where there's no more death, weeping, suffering, any kind of pain. And the city itself is quite amazing. It's identified as 1,500 miles on side, made of gold. It has one street in it. And it's built on the foundation of 12 precious stones. It has 12 gates. You're probably beginning to recognize the pattern here. 12 tribes of Israel. There's no temple because you worship God and the Lamb directly. There's no need for a temple. It's also to be a light to the world with its central tree of life to bring to healing to the nations. And remember, in Greek thinking, the nations, or the Gentiles, or the Goyim in Hebrew, that's everybody that isn't Jewish, right? So you might ask at this point, well, after all this destruction, who's left for this New Jerusalem to be the light to, right? Who are these people that comprise the nations? And again, in John's emphasis in this at the beginning, and then 5 times in the last chapter alone, is this is all happening soon, really, really soon. This is happening soon. He's writing this at the end of the 1st century. So how do we get from that to Weissenant writing, so confidently of these 88 reasons why the world is going to end in 1988, when the very author of this book is adamant that this is happening soon in his own lifetime. So let's go into the history of interpretation, and maybe I'll take any comments or questions on this stuff so far.
It's all perfectly clear.
It is. Well, if you don't have the lawn to mow this afternoon, I'd say crack Revelation open and read it, and it'll become even more clear. Yeah.
One thing that crossed my mind kind of briefly is that if it was resistance literature in those days, maybe it has that kind of function now. I mean, maybe there's this ideal that.
Keep that thought as we talk about the kind of the history of interpretation, and especially what began in the 19th century. Steve?
Well, you had no trouble finding gorgeous slides to represent your talk as you went through it.
Oh, there's
it
more
has
good ones to come.
affected the imagination of Western civilization very, very profoundly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, it is constituent of our way of thinking about life. It's not surprising that it suddenly reappears at times of crisis.
Yeah. So that's a good segue to start talking about, how was it interpreted after its authorship? And so Papias, one of the church fathers, saw it as this is proclaiming a time of coming richness for Christians. There's going to be some bad stuff, but in the end, there's going to be material richness for we true believers. And another church father, Irenaeus, supported that idea. A little bit after that, Hippolytus of Rome. And these are kind of the big names of the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christian thinking. Hippolytus of Rome opposed that and sort of put the issue to rest, suggesting, oh, the world's not going to end for another 300 years. I didn't go in to study his math behind that, but not tomorrow. So kind of, don't expect your riches to be coming tomorrow, but don't expect the end of the world tomorrow either. Victoritus was one of the first ones to really take a historical approach and identified the creature, or the kingdom Babylon as Rome and the beast as Nero, which is kind of an understanding that we've carried even into today. Eusebius, who is accredited with being the first church historian, he opposed the idea of it as coming riches too, and he had no problem criticizing other church fathers, and he said of Papias, he was remarkably unintelligent. You wouldn't want the great church historian to say that of you, but he did. So then, of course, Augustine, probably the most significant theologian of early Christianity, and a lot of his ideas we still hold today, he put forth an understanding that really lasted for centuries, well into and past the Reformation even. So his understanding was to reject the materialistic approach, that this was promise of great riches for Christians. And he said reading it literally misses the point. And for Augustine, lots of stuff was read allegorically. Much of Scripture he read allegorically. So for Augustine, the first resurrection was Jesus' resurrection. And then the promised millennium was life in the church, the establishment of the church on earth, and it spread, and he's seeing it, it spread throughout the Roman Empire. This is actually the experience of the millennium for Christians. And this view, like I said, dominated well past the Reformation period. There's one Middle Ages interpretation that's worth mentioning, because it's going to kind of, one aspect of it is going to kind of come back to life in one of the 19th century understandings. And this is Joachim of Fiore, Italy. He was a 13th century Cistercian monk, so a cloistered contemplative. And he had a vision, and it led him to an understanding that the Bible and Revelation really describe 3 ages. The time, history can be grouped into 3 ages. The age of the Father, which is a period of law and service lasting until Christ's resurrection. And then the age of the Son, which is characterized by grace and submission. And then finally the last age would be the age of the Spirit, which is direct and immediate knowledge of God through ecstatic and endless contemplation. What a surprise for a Cistercian monk to think that's the beautiful vision of the ultimate end of the world, culmination of history. So I think the thing to remember is just this idea that you can look back at history and see it broken into ages or periods. So hold on to that. There was one Reformation era revival of kind of some mudslinging that Elaine Pagels really does a good job of showing here, how the idea of the beast and the Antichrist was used even in the early first 3 or 4 centuries for some of the church fathers to accuse other church fathers who they assumed were heretics of heresy. So they were throwing mud at each other, just like in the Reformation. Martin Luther, who originally wanted to exclude the book of Revelation from the Bible, and in his German translation put it into an appendix. He eventually found it helpful in his battle with the Catholic Church, because he could identify Pope Leo as the Antichrist, and his followers created some nice graphics to support that. So here's in the center here, you can see Leo Papas Antichrist in Latin, and some of the others are identified along with him. And of course, that prompted Pope Leo to turn around and brand Luther as the Antichrist and come up with their own graphics that support Luther. Here's the Augustinian monk depicted with the shaved head, and is the Antichrist out here, doing what the Antichrist does. But generally, that that understanding that Augustine had really prevailed, that the millennium was being realized now in the age of the church and the dominance of the church in the world. So when did these kind of futuristic understandings arise? And this was what I found really interesting in Bart Ehrman's book, that you can really trace it back to some world events, starting with some Christians in Britain reacting to the French Revolution and how unsettling that was to kind of the static world of Europe at the time. And that for them, that revived an understanding that the book of Revelation may be predicting future events. And we have to own this. There's some Anglican theologians from our own tradition in the 1790s who did some of this crazy math and said, well, you know, the Pope didn't really assume power in the Western Church until 538, and we know that Revelation describes the 42-month period of reign before the beast gets his damaging blow. So 42 months of years, each month being 1 year, that's 1,260 years. And if you add that to 538 Common Era, that gets you to the year 798. And guess what? That's the year that Napoleon's chief of staff banished the Pope from the Vatican. That's, I think, when Pope went into exile in Avignon, France. Is that right? But anyway, so yeah, there we go. That's the mortal blow to the beast that was predicted in Revelation 13:3. So here's, you know, not unlike the author of the 88 Reasons Why the Rapture is going to happen in 1988. Here's somebody taking current events and trying to see how this late first century document, apocalyptic literature, somehow anticipated these events and these durations and see now what's happening. There was another interesting historical sentiment happening at the same time in Britain, and that was British interest in the fate of the Jewish people. And it just happened. There were these two guys, John Way and Lewis Way, and they have no relation, just coincidentally have the same name. And they met, they formed a strong relationship based on their evangelical views. John was a wealthy man with no family. Lewis was a mediocre attorney. And when John passed away, he left his fortune to Lewis, which in today's dollars is $42 million. So it's a pretty big fortune. And based on Lewis Way's interest in the fate of the Jewish people, he basically built a college on this estate that he inherited to educate missionaries to the Jews. And the rising popularity of this movement was what fueled the thinking that we're seeing the end times coming, and it led to the rise of dispensational premillennialism, which we talk about all the time, right?
Oh, yeah, every day.
Everybody? Anybody here a premillennial dispensationalist? What is that even, right? I mean, believe me, that is not in the scriptures anywhere. So, what is it? So, this movement that we saw in England with this interest in the fate of the Jews, and okay, maybe Revelation is predicting, you know, things that are about to happen and now, was becoming more and more popular, and it kind of marked the beginning of the end of the predominance of Augustine's view about Revelation. And there were kind of two camps about this, kind of an optimistic camp, kind of a pessimistic camp. And the optimistic camp was kind of in the American colonies at this time, and that camp championed the idea that, you know, human achievement, we're just getting better and better. And so, you know, the millennium is going to be God's reward to how much we as humans are achieving. And this quote from Jonathan Edwards, who was American colonialist who introduced evangelicalism to the Great Awakening, I think is great. Allow me to say that in America, the state of society is without parallel in universal history. With all our mixtures, there is a leaven of heaven there. There is goodness there. There is excellent principle there. I really believe that God has got America within anchorage, and that upon that arena he intends to display his prodigies for the millennium. So, things are looking pretty good, right? American exceptionalism, right?
We're talking about 1740s at that
Yeah, the first Great Awakening.
Great Awakening.
Yeah. Some evangelical circles in Britain were less hopeful, and this guy here, John Nelson Darby, Irishman, former Anglican priest, was probably the prominent voice and movement founder. He founded the Plymouth Brethren in 1830. They were strict, bias, back to the Bible, no professional clergy, which is interesting because, of course, he was a trained clergyman. They professed a literal interpretation of the Bible, and the movement, and the Plymouth Brethren are still with us today. They spread within the UK and within the US. They never grew to be a large denomination, but they really advanced two modern ideas. They advanced the modern idea that Christ will return two times, once before all this destruction told in Revelation, and once after the destruction to establish the millennium. And this became the pre-millennialist view. Now the dispensation part of that, remember Joachim Fiore had these 3 ages he saw the world in. Darby saw history in discrete periods as well, and he saw it in 7, and he called them dispensations, periods when people obeyed and worshipped God differently. So the age of innocence was the first, marked from creation of Adam to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Second age, from the expulsion of the Garden of Eden to the flood, God getting angry and destroying the world and saving part of it. Human government from the flood to Abraham. The promise, the period from Abraham to Moses. So the promise made to Abraham, I'll make you a father of many nations. Then the period of the law. So Moses receiving the law to Christ. And then from the time of Christ, we're in the age of the church, or grace. And that's going to last to the end of history, and then at the end of history we'll have the kingdom. That's when God will destroy the evil, cleanse the earth, and commence a millennium for all the believers in a new Jerusalem. And I do remember, I think I may have seen this graphic when I was a kid, like it was scary enough to go to the doctor or the dentist, but usually they had those children's Bibles in the waiting room there with the most horrifying pictures. I kind of remember seeing this. I mean, if it wasn't bad enough that I had to get a filling, I had to get scared to death by the stuff before. So anyway, so we still don't have a rapture yet. Not all dispensational premillennialists agree. Some saw the spread of Christianity advancements of culture as hopeful to what lay ahead, like what we saw from Jonathan Edwards and the optimism of the 18th century US. Darby's group didn't feel that way. I can't imagine that would have been a fun group to hang around with. But in 1833, he hatched this new idea that the followers of Jesus did not have to experience all these catastrophes. Christ would come back 2 more times, once to escort his followers away before all the bad stuff happened, and then again after the 7 years of tribulation, he'd come back to collect more followers, defeat his enemies, and bring his millennial kingdom into existence. And Darby called this the secret rapture, since no one knew the time or the place. So this is a lot of pretty creative thinking going on. How did it take over? Well, it split the Plymouth Brethren. The variants that emerged that contained this pre-millennial dispensationalism was more popular in America than Britain, aren't we lucky? And it really started to gain some traction at the Second Great Awakening in New York in the late 19th century. And it was popularized even as evangelicals were feeling some threats from things like science, right? I mean, in the emerging science, Darwinism, the idea that, well, maybe the creation stories in first Genesis aren't literally true. Geology is teaching us that the Earth's a lot older than what you might add up from all the narratives in Genesis as well. And then over in Germany, we've got German scholarship starting to explore the Bible using historical criticism. So these are all threats to the faith, and so the response of the movement was to form doctrines of biblical inerrancy. All right, that isn't a doctrine that appeared anywhere else in church history before this time. And one of the main tenets that also emerged was this idea of dispensational premillennialism, that there will be this time when we are going to be whisked away in the rapture and all these awful things are going to happen to everybody else. So this pessimism wasn't really made any better in the 20th century when World War I, followed by the Great Depression, followed by World War II, followed by the Cold War, and we could probably keep going, followed by globalization that's been good for some people, not good for other people, climate change, global inequity, and so on. So that's really where Rapture came in. So I got a couple concluding slides. Why does any of this matter? There have been real world consequences to this. So does anybody know the story of the Millerites? Yeah, Kevin, you want to?
They thought Christ would come.
In 1843, and
It was called the Great Disappointment because he did not.
yeah, and they got it wrong twice, because the first time was 1843,
And a lot
and
of them had
people
sold
sold
everything.
stuff,
Yeah.
and they chose not to harvest crops, and that didn't happen, and I think they found a math error, and said, oh, it's really 1844. And I think the math error, if I remember right, was there was no year zero, right? We went from 1 BC to 1 BCE to 1 BC. So anyway, that was kind of the explanation. But again, in 1844, it didn't happen again. And in fact, it's an interesting. There's an interesting Wikipedia entry on the Millerites if you want to read more about that.
Were they focused in a certain place?
Yeah, I want to say they were like in Ohio. I can't remember. Oh, it'll come back. Yeah, I think it was mostly in the upper Midwest, not as far west as the Dakotas, but I think that was the area. And even in the aftermath of this great disappointment, which was in the press and everywhere, there were 33 identifiable groups that splintered from the Millerites, and most of them carried this idea of rapture forward, but emphasized we don't know the date or the time, right, to avoid the mistake of picking a date and being wrong. Another real world consequence of this, the disaster at Waco, Texas, right, which we all watched play out on TV. The Branch Davidians derived from one of those 33 groups. So, in fact, I think it's in this book. It's in one of these two books where the author has a colleague who is an expert in this field and was called in by the FBI to help the FBI understand the thinking of the people that were holed up at Waco. And he just really went at great lengths to try to convince the FBI how seriously this group is taking this. They really believe that they are ushering in the end times in their actions. Another real world consequence is, even tracing it back to the arrival of interest in the fate of the Jewish people in 19th century England, 19th century England. Even today, our own politicians some of them have carried some of these ideas to shape how they vote with respect to global policy. We have political policy in the U.S., foreign policy, I should say, toward how they support various countries in the Middle East today,
Craig,
Israel or other countries.
is that red calf notion in the book of Revelation?
Yeah, and there's that, was it a senator or a
It's
representative?
pretty widespread.
It is,
through our
yeah.
government.
There was a senator or representative from Texas who was shipping red heifers to
Yeah,
Israel.
the semen of whatever
Yeah.
animal was going to
Yeah.
produce the red ox.
So, these are real world consequences. And I think another one, and maybe I'll put this one up and let's talk about these, our attitudes towards the environment and climate, and not just the environment and climate, but also to our fellow people in the world. I mean, if our thinking is, it doesn't really matter because the world's coming to an end, I have the right beliefs, I'm going to be raptured away, too bad you're going to suffer. How do you square that with love your enemy? Do pray for your enemies, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, how can you reconcile any of that with Jesus' active ministry? When the scribe puts him on the spot, one of the most important, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, right? How can you adopt a view that sorry, you just have the wrong beliefs, you're gonna burn, and you're gonna suffer all these things, the lake of fire or whatever, or care for the planet, right? I mean, we're stewards of the planet, that's the charge in Genesis. How do you take that seriously if you think, oh, it doesn't matter, it's all gonna end anyway? I think those are the real world consequences of that view.
I mean, this is sort of going back to the bullet point above that political thing, but isn't somehow the fact that we got our embassy now in Jerusalem tied to that? I mean, that was a big thing.
That's right. I do remember that that was I think a political play to Trump's supporters that
Yeah.
they want to see that happen. I think that'll factor.
Preparing for the big end.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes it's not just preparing for it, but trying to bring
Bringing
it
it
forward.
into-
Right.
Yeah,
Actively
pushing it
trying
into-
to. Yeah. And if you really, if we don't know the date and the time, then
But better tomorrow than the day after.
yeah. I mean, I don't know how many conversations anybody has on these topics with any of your friends. I have a tennis partner who is one of the pastors at the Calvary Chapel, and we get into some of these conversations sometimes, and we're both very respectful of it. But at one point I did have to say, well, what's at stake for you with this? And he said, oh, everything. He said, I have my whole life is based on these things being true, and by believing them, I know that I will be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. Okay, I'm not going to try to shape that, but I also think that's potentially kind of fragile too.
I mean, there've been so many instances of people being wrong
Yeah.
about it, so, and the whole, the Mayan calendar and all that. I mean, every culture, a lot of cultures have these kind of prophecies, but I don't know, maybe the date is important, it's just that eventually there will be an end.
Why do you think that?
Yeah, I noticed you didn't bring up Nostradamus.
Oh, is he in there doing this too?
He's mentioned in Al Lindsay's book,
Oh, okay.
and the quatrains by Nostradamus portend much the same.
Mm-hmm.
He's another one of the people who said this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And when I hear these stories, I have to tell you, I think about, apparently there are some people who just want to believe that all those other people are going to suffer. And I'm not sure where does that mindset come from? What is it about a person that they want to think, well, is it that they're so unhappy in themselves? Is that it? That they want to believe that someday they're going to be rewarded for being unhappy, but everybody else is going to be in pain? I mean,
Left out.
I don't understand why we think that way. which is,
Yeah.
Well, because we want to be part of the elite.
Yeah. But that attitude
But
is
then,
so-
I mean, if we're really paid attention to the Gospels, like, the first shall be last,
Yeah.
last shall be first, to be a servant to all. I mean, that's really the call, right, is servant posture, not an elite posture.
Well, and the whole idea of grace is lost in that transaction.
Yeah,
too.
God's grace is
There's
sufficient
no-
for everyone, maybe.
Yes.
Which-
But if I have to earn it by believing this narrow set of beliefs, then,
Yeah.
then God, sucks to be that person.
Yeah.
So I thought that ideas of the rapture came from, like Thessalonians, where
There
it
is,
says the dead
meet
shall
you in
rise
the
first
clouds.
and meet in the clouds,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
and Jesus talks about the end times, and there will be two men working in the field, and one shall be taken and the other left.
yeah.
That kind of thing. Does that come up in your?
It does come up, and Herman says, here's why that really does, and I can't remember, I didn't go into the detail on that one, but yeah, he pretty quickly dismissed that as supporting the rapture, although those would be some of the proof texts, and then a bunch of stuff in the Old Testament that Darby would have drawn on, yeah. What I thought was interesting was, what do most people believe about the end times? So if you can, yeah, we can see this okay. The most recent Pew Research Center on the question, do you believe we're living in the end times? Broken down, everybody, and then broken down by different Christian groups, other religions, unaffiliated, political identification, education levels, and race. So, anything surprising up there?
yeah.
Why would an atheist believe in the end times of all? I mean, what is that 9%?
Well, but I mean, I think somebody could say, gosh, all this talk about climate change and, globalization, and we have nuclear weapons now, and we can, wipe each other out numerous times over, and there's, I think you could, whether you have a faith tradition or not, you could say, wow, there's some scary things happening there, and maybe that means
That's true.
the end is coming.
Right, I see what I perceive to be a new age thinking there that's under other religion and unaffiliated, which also sometimes could be, I'm making it up as I go along, or I've got a deck of tarot cards, or but that, that's a fairly high percentage of the American population that's
Yeah.
in there.
It looks like naively, it looks like it varies where the bar chart is greater into the yes among the group that believes or is actually feeling some disenfranchisement or lack of power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So it's really
and which is a great point, because originally, she's identified this as resistance literature.
Well, yeah,
Right.
you can find that.
Yeah, so, could this be, we're feeling persecuted, we're threatened by science and geology and,
Feminism.
well, yeah. I mean, all the things now that all the isms that you might feel threatened by, this is the way to hunker down
Or in the case of this, the lack of population is an actual real threat over 200 years.
yeah,
Or if you have reason to be dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, you're more eager to listen to people who say that it's about to come to an end.
yeah. And for me, I was thinking, gee, I mean, I'm much happier, I think I'm much happier to be alive now than before modern medicine and technology that allows for, more of the world's population to, not suffer as much. I mean, there's still, great inequities, but, about a month from now, I'm gonna get my hip replaced. And, 100 years ago, I'd just keep limping around until I died. That's not gonna be the
You'd probably
case.
be dead already.
I probably would. Actually,
Sorry.
yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, statistically,
I'll put you on the iceberg.
I'd probably be close to being dead already, so.
Where would the Mormon Church fit into that? With Christians?
Oh,
I don't
that's,
know. They're kind of hard to peg.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess I would think they probably wouldn't be too different than evangelical, but I don't know. I mean, Sheldon were here, he could answer that question
Yeah,
for us.
and the number of African Americans there who are Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. But
Is that, yeah.
That's a lot of,
Yeah, and the Seventh-day Adventists can trace back to the,
Yeah.
they're one of the 33 splinters of the Millerites. Yeah. So I subscribe to the New Yorker, and there's a cartoonist, Roz Chass, who does, she has a recurring character. It's the guy carrying the end his near sign on the streets. So this came out like 2 weeks ago. So, so whatever you may think is going to happen tomorrow, probably be a good idea to put on camera.
It's like my grandmother.
Yeah, that was great. So I'm interested in some feedback. This whole Rapture thing. I got interested in it because I read this book and I thought, this is a crazy story. I mean, the Book of Revelation is a crazy book to read anyway, but just to see how it played out over time, and especially how kind of the intersection of some modern science thinking and some pretty radical change in the European world politically, all came together and fueled this. And I was going to look this up. I'm going to go off memory, but I was curious, what did the Left Behind series of books and shows net? I couldn't find the net value, but I think they grossed like $146 million.
Very possible.
So there's an astonishing fascination with this, and a lot of fiction built around it, which only reinforces the underlying ideas, I think.
Yeah, because then people believe it. I read it in a book.
Yeah,
Must be true.
it's on TV.
I have a question. You said that Darby's seventh dispensation was the kingdom?
The kingdom, yeah.
They had setting up the millennium.
Yeah, let me go back
That was
to
on
that.
the slide. But did they mean a literal millennium of 1,000 years?
Yeah, I don't know.
If they did, what came after that, since that's the last stage? That's where I was trying to think about if I were to draw a timeline, pulling, all the times of those, of the Book of Revelation. I'm not sure I could make it would be a nonsensical kind of timeline, so I don't know if a millennial was like, we talk about 40 years in the Bible, and that's usually represents a generation, right? Or 40 days is a long time, or 12 is a perfect number, 7 is a perfect number. So millennial may not have been open-ended.
Yeah, it might have been open-ended. It might have been like almost like an infinitely long time. I don't know.
Covered a lot of ground, thanks.
I know. I felt like out of breath, but yeah, it was fun to put it together, and I especially like finding the graphics, to break up a slide, the words on the slide, and boy, the stuff you had to pick from, it's just overwhelming.
well, good job with the dentist office. I've forgotten all about those strange little Bibles.
Yeah.
And that
Oh, I'm sorry if that conjures up.
well, it's hard for a child to see that stuff. I went to Sunday school in this building, and we didn't get this. But
I will
there are
never
people around the
forget the ark floating away and the people in the water.
Oh, right.
That image, frantically waving to get on the ark. That's seared in my memory.
Good way to scare a little kid.
Huh?
Good way to scare a little kid.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all. Oh, and next week, Sheldon Greaves is going to do the first of 2 weeks presentation on the brain science of Ian McGilchrist. It's really interesting. Ian McGilchrist got his PhD at either Oxford or Cambridge in literature, and he was like a poetry critic. And then he realized, what am I doing? I'm deconstructing this poem, and it's really the poem as a whole that is beautiful and meaningful. And that got him thinking about, how our brains function, and so he went and got a neuroscience medical degree and developed this understanding of how the two hemispheres of our brains act, interact, function, and has pushed this out to an understanding of how the Western world has kind of come to be as it is by left hemisphere predominance over the right hemisphere. It's really interesting stuff. At Sheldon's master, I strongly recommend coming.
Thank you. Yeah, looking forward to it.